Today, yes, it is official. I'm starting the One Strategy for Life series. We'll talk about everything: how to enter, how to decide on entries, when to enter or exit, how to find bias. I'll also talk about different type of order managements, how to handle trades, when to take profits. We have so much to cover. If you're ready, let's start. I'm starting a new series which will continue like 10 or 20 videos. One Strategy for Life series. Basically, I'll apply the same trading strategy which we learned last week. Please watch that video if you missed it. This is the second video of the series. Basically, we will keep using similar strategies over and over. I'll show my real trade recaps and practice examples. This will be a very exciting series and definitely improve your trading skills a lot. Let's start with the best trade of the week, OP coin. This was a crazy sniper trade. As usual, when I was scanning the coins one by one, remember, I do not have any kind of special algorithm. My eyes are the algorithm itself, which sees everything. I have noticed this perfect setup with OP in 30 minutes. I tweeted my interest on Twitter before I entered the trade, which some people took the trade. Follow me on Twitter if you want to catch these trades. Let's take a closer look what my eyes saw. Notice this top point here, not an ordinary point. It is the current year high and previous week high together. A very interesting liquidity point. A very high quality one. And just below it, notice what we have. A very nice downtrend liquidity. Okay, we have a great target. But do we have enough fuel to push the price up? Notice this extremely good swing failure pattern here. A very strong rejection. Notice this wick here. And what happens here? Market structure breaks with a very strong momentum. As you see, we follow our main strategy. Let's deep dive here. Check this out, how this imbalance fails here. The momentum destroys that imbalance. That failed imbalance is now turned into a support area. And the new bullish imbalance holds the price very well. Actually, if you apply your range tool, you can notice the very obvious range with manipulation and deviation below. And believe me, I drove none of this. I just see all this because I practiced this kind of charts a lot in the previous years. I only drove all this for you to see what I see. Now for a moment, let's switch back to the daily time frame. This is the daily time frame. Notice what you see here. A giant daily imbalance. Price sweeps the liquidity with a swing failure pattern and taps the daily imbalance. In daily perspective, this price is extremely bullish and filled up. There is only one single direction to go, up, up, up. Let's get back to the 30-minute time frame. So, this is the point of perfection. Price taps daily imbalance, range deviation area, and the swing failure pattern. Now let me switch to the 15-minute time frame and get a very closer look at the area. Remember the first video of One Strategy for the Life series. The inner structure shift will be your extra confirmation to enter sniper trades. Notice the tiny shift here, which also creates its own imbalance. What else do we have here? The PDM, previous day EQ area. A great amplifier to enter a trade which intersects with my entry imbalance. What else do we have here? Notice these highs. the Monday high and the previous day high point, which creates extra liquidity areas for us. This is how to build this 5-hour setup to trade. Now, this kind of sniper setups will not happen every single day. But these are magical setups to trade and very profitable ones. Let's talk about another trade recap, R&DR, a very similar setup but more complicated than it looks. First of all, we have two significant liquidity points up. The current year high with the previous day high, high quality points. And the price sweeps the Monday low here. Not just that, it also sweeps the previous day low as well. Not ending here, and notice the considerable swing failure pattern here. Finally, the imbalance below them. As you can see, this was an extreme amount of fuel in my mind to push the price into a direction. Plus, we had this PWM area, last week's EQ point. Now let me switch to the 4 hours time frame and notice this parabolic area, which is quite troublesome for me. In my personal opinion, right here after the swing failure pattern, we have this BPR area. This would be a great point to look for entries. Even though I took a short-term long trade on this chart, I also had my concerns of bearishness. So this was a troublesome trade. I'll teach you this because you must learn how to manage your risk. Now let's check out the 15-minute time frame and my entry. After all those extreme amounts of liquidity sweeps, I was convinced we got all fuel needed. I noticed the structure shifted here. This is why I have tweeted this on Twitter. As I said, I have an interest in R&DR, but it would be best to build a hedge position. First long it, then short it. I also noticed DO, a daily open amplifier, which intersects with the entry imbalance. As for targets, I had these open imbalances above, with Monday high and previous day EQ amplifiers. Unlike OP trade, this was a quick trade setup with 2R. Because the parabolic liquidity below with 4-hour time frame, it concerned me a lot. This could have been another huge sniper, but I enjoy the money in my pocket rather than other pockets. This was it, friends. I'll continue this One Strategy for Life series for a long time, and I will keep improving your perspective on how to trade any chart. Take care, see you in the next video. If you have completed the free trading course and feel like you improved your trading skills, but you need more, an extra, a boost, and you want to move to the next level in your trading life, my masterclass is ready for you. You'll learn liquidity, inefficiencies, and structure mastery deeply. And we will look at forward and reverse trading with momentum super boxes. You will learn how to confirm your entries with magic alignment system. Finally, you'll discover a strategy called YOYO strategy, which will open new doors for you about taking and managing trades. If you are interested, you can find links on my website on the description. Take care, friends, manage your risks, and stay safe.